You're a startup founder. You think your product is amazing and feel like more people should be buying, but the road is long and slow. It feels like you're stuck. There's always one thing I ask startup founders. Have you talked to your customers? They almost always say, heck yes, we talk to our customers all the time. But what I find is they're either selling or trying to improve their product. These are not customer-focused conversations. If we can get curious about our customers, then we can uncover critical insights that will help us build to the next round. I'm Anna Firmenov, and welcome to Building with Buyers, a show about startup growth where I'll explore how customers help startups build to the next round. All right, Kevin Lau is VP of Global Customer Marketing at Freshworks. Kevin, everybody's been telling me you need to get Kevin on the show. And I'm like, who is this Kevin? Like, everybody has mentioned you. I feel like there's a very tight-knit customer marketing community and like people know one another. And so I'm kind of not surprised that they know you very well and they recommended that you come on. So I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the sentiment, and it's great to meet you and connect and chat all things customer and beyond.
Yeah. And so I didn't know where the podcast season 5 would take me. I wanted to talk about, building with buyers. I renamed the show to Building with Buyers, and I didn't really have like an idea of who I would bring on the show. And then suddenly things kind of clicked, and I'm like, wait a second. Who's building with buyers? Like, this is customer marketing. It's very specific. I mean, I would argue like product marketing also builds because they care about customers and, they do some of that customer research to build positioning, messaging, all that stuff. But customer marketers, that's your focus. So happy to have you here. So Freshworks provides AI-assisted IT and customer service software to over 75,000 companies. That's a lot. You guys have 9,500 plus people, if I'm not mistaken, and you've IPO'd. That was back in 2021. So it is a little bit of a different flavor company than I am used to bringing on the show. But I think that you got recommended multiple times. So of course I had to have you on. But I think that we could learn a lot from some of the more interesting, creative, maybe more sophisticated, maybe not. It doesn't have to be sophisticated, right? Sometimes it's the very simple stuff that works. So let's talk about that. I'm exploring the role that customers play in helping companies build to their next level of growth. I think customers are extremely important. I don't think people stop to consider how important their customers are. I think marketers are very focused on net new most of the time because their goals are kind of set to, we need more, right? So we're chasing net new all the time. But customer love is so important. And I think the companies that feel it ends up showing up as like, well, why can't we get customers on research calls?
Yeah.
Well, because you never built that relationship, right? You didn't nurture that. You didn't have anything kind of to give them. It was always like take, right? If you ever asked for anything. So then it ends up being like, we can't get our customers to say anything good about us. We can't get our customers to come fly to a conference where they can speak about us. We can't get our customers to partner with us. And that sucks. And so this season, I've been talking a lot about that, how it's a huge opportunity and missed opportunity. So let's start with who's on your team. And I think I know a little bit about this because I looked it up, and it sounds like there's a lot of folks: life cycle, retention, advocacy, community, education, voice of customer, which I'm extremely interested to talk a little bit more about, executive engagement, and comms, communication. So is that kind of like who works under you?
Yeah, so, and I can give you a little background if it's helpful as well. So I've been at Freshworks now for a little bit over a year and a half. And essentially, when we kind of thought about the overall org and the design, it was really around like, how are we going to create this sort of flywheel where when we think about the customer journey, everyone has some kind of journey slide or some kind of framework. Oftentimes, I think especially from a SaaS standpoint, the journey is a little bit too focused on net new. Oftentimes, we're very clear in terms of what the buy phase of the journey looks like. You have prospects, you move them down a funnel, you eventually get them to purchase, and then they're kind of left to their own devices to kind of figure it out. And we have sort of this disconnect when it comes to how do we really think about ensuring that both sides of the equation are really equal? Because if you're driving new business and you don't have a strategy or plan for how you're going to retain them, you essentially have a leaky bucket. So when I designed kind of the team and the organization, it was really, and I think this is where sometimes customer marketing is a little bit misunderstood. We tend to focus on things that are much later in the journey that we can't really control. And so we're left to all these other functions and teams to make sure the customers are getting to a point where they want to be an advocate, that they want to be able to be a voice for your company. But there's a lot of other dependencies that we really don't have any ability to kind of influence. You're at the mercy of kind of support, customer success, and other groups that, frankly, there's not really a centralized team that kind of owns all that. And oftentimes you're kind of just left to kind of figure it out. With all that kind of taking place, like I really thought about it for a long time, thinking about what are the functions that we need that are really going to help drive sort of that flywheel effect. And it's taken time to kind of build it piece by piece, but that's kind of essentially how we kind of thought about those 6 to 7 pillars at Freshworks.
So before you came on board, you didn't have all these folks as part of.
No, it was definitely a build. Definitely
it was a build. Okay. And so who came on first? Like, what was most important, I guess? Who came on first, or did you kind of hire all of these different areas at once?
Yeah, I mean, so I kind of classified it as sort of like an evolution. There were some functions that did exist. There's some things that we had to kind of establish. Some of it was also kind of change the identity of what customer marketing is. So I've talked to
Can you talk about that? I'm just like curious because you said people misunderstand customer marketing, and now you're kind of like defining what it means at Freshworks. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Like, how did you kind of fix the misunderstanding and redefine it?
So and I think this is kind of across the B2B industry for the most part, a lot of the term customer marketing, because it has customer in the frame, like it can mean almost anything as far as like how do you market to that customer. But the classic example is that most people think it's primarily customer advocacy. It's like, how do you build a raving fan base? How do you get more case studies? How do you support your sales teams with references? That is probably still what 95% of the industry is known for. And when you think about your C-suite, they don't know the nuances. They don't understand the differences. They understand demand gen because it's the lead pipeline generation. But when you think about all the other flavors of marketing, like it gets lost on folks. And so part of the definition change was like, we historically were running an advocacy team, which was very much transactional. It's like our sales team needs more case studies. We need more content. We need more proof. We need more evidence. And by the way, we also need your customers to speak at all these events for us. We need them to do all these things. But it was a very one-sided relationship. Like if you're advocating for a brand and you love that product, there's kind of a limit to how much you want to be able to actually do that, right? And so you have to be able to kind of think about it from what's going to drive the pipeline and the growth so that you can create more advocates. Then how do you create that relationship? When you think about sort of like research and customers wanting to sit down with an individual for 20 to 30 minutes and talk about pain points, what do they love about your solution? It's kind of the same thing. You have to be able to cultivate that relationship before you can make the ask. And so with that being in mind, and what I think about customer marketing holistically is that it's meant to support the overall customer journey. Advocacy is kind of a dependency across all these other stages going really well and ensuring that the customer realizes value. And that starts very early in their onboarding adoption phase, right? And so we had to kind of build out these functions piece by piece, but really highlighting the major dependency of if you want more raving fans or more loyal advocates, we need to shore up and figure out all the other pieces much earlier in the journey to make sure that they see value. They understand exactly what your product does. And you can essentially create sort of this on-ramp for future evangelism down the road. So that's kind of how I thought about it. So we built all these kind of functions piece by piece. One of the most interesting thing was we started to build out this adoption and retention marketing team. And we started to think about groups, buyers within our personas focused on like practitioners, influencers, and executives. So in each organization, slightly different, but essentially the executive is the one that has contract authority. They're the folks that are paying, for your solution. But then you also have to be able to influence your practitioners that are using the products day to day. And sort of that influencer band, which they have sort of the authority and the ear of the executive, and that stage where they're looking for career progression, they're looking for opportunities to network with others. And so how do you build a program or a set of programs and a function that kind of supports all those different levers? And you can obviously do this in stages, and each company is slightly different, but how you approach it essentially to serve your overall customer base, but what's low-hanging fruit that you could really make an impact against. And
Yeah.
for us, like, we want to start with, building at the very beginning, which was really around sort of the retention adoption pieces. And that became the foundation for as we started to build all these other functions too.
So customer advocacy makes sense to me. How would you say, like in like a sentence, you kind of redefined what customer marketing meant to at Freshworks? Because like you said, most people, most B2B companies, they focus on the advocacy piece. They focus on like the case studies. They focus on like, we need them to come and talk at these events, sales enablement stuff. But how would you just like simply state? Because there's just like a lot. It seems like a lot, right? You did a lot, right? In the year and a half that you've been at the company, and you kind of grew out the team. You're focused more earlier, right? Like adoption of the product, making sure they see value. How would you simplify the explanation of we don't just have customer advocacy, there's also this piece called customer marketing, and what is it?
Yeah, I think the general kind of simple statement is that we support the overall customer journey through adoption and retention, ultimately to create evangelists and customers for life. That's kind of the terminology I use. And when I say customers for life, it's the idea around if you can deliver such an incredible customer experience. I think the term customer experience tends to be a little bit overused, but the concept being like if you create such a great experience for your end user, they'll take you to every organization that they work for in the future. So you can create that. And I saw that in the companies that I've worked at previously, whether it was Marketo and Adobe, even Google for that matter, like companies that deliver really great world-class service, you want to continue working with them. And I think you could use that same kind of lens when you think about it from a personal experience of, the brands that you support, the organizations that you want to do business with. A lot of those things are very transferable to the B2B world. I think sometimes people forget that you're dealing with humans at the end of the day, humans that have a choice. And a lot of it goes back to the relationship, how you build that.
Yeah, I think that relationship piece is key because so I work with my clients on customer research, and there are some customers that are like, yes, I'll talk to you, right? I don't need any money. Like, I will tell you, what do you want to know about me and my
Yeah.
experience and my journey? And there are some customers that don't respond. And it's like, they might have a ton of them too, right? But there was no sort of like focus on that customer love piece. So I run into this too in the work that I do. I wanted to ask you, how does customer marketing work with product marketing? Is product marketing separate, like with separate VP of product marketing, and you guys kind of work together?
It's separate in our org. So, and maybe it's helpful just within marketing, the way that we have kind of the functions broken up. We have demand gen, we have customer marketing, we have product marketing, we have brand and PR. Essentially, that's kind of like the five functions. I've been in organizations too where product marketing owns customer marketing, they own advocacy. The reason why I think intentionally we want to do it a little bit differently is that there's natural synergies when it comes to product marketing around messaging. They deal with a lot of things around how do they enable the go to market from an enablement perspective. Pricing and packaging is another piece. How do we translate the product roadmap and, essentially what the product and engineering teams are building and drive it to go to market? That's like classic product marketing. And where customer marketing kind of fits into that to some degree is largely, I think, when it comes to the advocacy components. There's obviously like, how do you build competitive battle cards? How do you get customer voices and feedback captured? How can you ensure that you're leveraging a lot of the case studies and customer content that's being produced to help reinforce some of the messaging that the product marketing team is developing? But there is a lot of other things that I think there's also joint synergies. We're actually tackling it from an adoption or retention piece too. Because historically, the way that we thought about adoption as a company was a little bit fragmented. It was like a customer using a solution once per month. To me, that's not necessarily adoption. That's just basically they're playing around with the solution, but it's not driving stickiness. And so we work very close with the product marketing team to kind of figure out like, how do we build these programs aligned to the journey and think about the overall life cycle that a customer is going through, and what are those moments that matter along that timeline, and how do we build very prescriptive plays so that we're really kind of supporting it from kind of end to end. It also does incorporate some of the work that the demand gen team is doing, because they also look at it from a lens around expansion in lead lifecycle. So we have a team that kind of focuses on the trial to paid conversion experience, and then the expansion motion to get them to essentially cross-sell, upsell as well.
You've got a lot of teams sort of working. They need to work lockstep with each other. How do people make sure not to step on each other's toes? Right? Because there's some overlap here and there.
I mean, I could say like we have some solutions in place, but it's always a challenge, I think, at the end of the day. Some of it, especially timing wise, as we're recording this, we're looking at AOP, we're looking at finalizing plans going into 26. And so we spent a lot of time over the past couple of months just kind of aligning on what are sort of those 5, 6 big rocks that we want to do within marketing. So having alignment, at least from a leadership perspective, on how we want to essentially make big waves and impact. When I went back to the example around your executive team doesn't necessarily know all the flavors of marketing. They just see marketing doing stuff for the business. We have to kind of show up together as a collective team, and each team has a role to play in terms of how we're supporting the new business side of the equation, as well as the post-sale experience. Obviously, like what we just talked about, a lot of the things that we do in customer marketing are post-sale. But when we think about things like, if we have a major launch or campaign, that impacts all aspects of the business. That could be everything from the types of events we want to run, the conferences we want to host, how we're going to land the messaging from a PR angle. How do we essentially enable the account team so that once the announcement goes out, like they know exactly what to sell? And then how do we amplify that message through a brand narrative and everything else? So I think it starts with making sure that we're clear on what are the major 5 or so things that we want to do really well. And then what are those dependencies that we also need to address within our own teams, and making sure that we have sort of like an interlock so it's much more consistent. When I first started, and, there was a little bit of kind of overlap. There was sort of like siloed thinking. There were things that were broken up into kind of pieces and components, but it wouldn't necessarily address the overall picture of what we're trying to solve for. That's going to drive like, real business impact and growth within the organization. But every time you launch something or do something a little bit better and you have a new leader join, there's slight refinements. So I don't think it's never going to be a point where you have it all figured out. In every company, regardless if you're a 200-person startup to a 100,000-person organization, it gets much more complex. But I think fundamentally it starts with just getting in a room and making sure that the leaders are clear. And then how do you drive that top-down alignment and really kind of address all the dependencies along the way?
Yeah. It sounds like though your marketing, the marketing org, all the different folks that roll into marketing, you're collaborating, right? Like you're very collaborative. And so I think that's what's necessary.
Totally. Yeah.
So that's a positive thing. One quick question, because I'm super curious. Voice of customer, typically that lands under product marketing, but you own it. So tell me more about that. Like talking to customers, voice of customer, customer research. What are you guys doing within your voice of customer? Like, is it one person doing this voice of customer research? Is it like a few people? Tell me more. And then like, what is the research you're doing?
So I would say voice of customer is also one of those things that can mean multiple things depending on where it sits in the function.
Tell me what you think it means.
I think it personally means like, how are we addressing customer friction? And how do we make it easier to do business with you as an organization at the end of the day? Like if we bottom lined it, that's really what I'm saying. I've seen voice of customer sit in many different company organization pieces. Sometimes it's in marketing, sometimes it's in a CX function, could be in products, to your point, could be in product marketing. What we're really trying to solve for is the fact that like historically, we didn't have a fully fledged feedback mechanism. Like we had feedback that was coming in from many different channels, very disjointed. If you think about sort of if you're trying to create a flywheel, we had probably 20 to 30 different signal posts that were all kind of happening within the product itself, through account teams, CSAT surveys. They were very transactional nature. We had an NPS that was kind of rolling out in product that was kind of being not monitored at all. And then a bunch of other surveys and touch points. So the low hanging fruit, of course, is like if you can get to a baseline of what your NPS is, that's foundational. It's not the only measure of success, but it's one that a lot of companies look at just as a kind of a direction post of where you want to go. So it started with kind of building out this team. And we went through this evolution from the beginning for the past 12 to 14 months. And part of it was really looking at how do we get to a baseline of what our NPS is? How do we get to an understanding of what is the biggest drivers of friction and what's going to help actually reduce churn? So the way that we're actually building the team out, so there's about 3 or 4 people that have responsibility. So we have a couple analysts. We have kind of a main lead that drives kind of like the strategy and program management. And they also work to ensure that there's more integrated feedback mechanisms throughout the business. So we use Qualtrics as one of our systems of record. And part of that is to make sure that we aggregate all the feedback into that one platform. And that's been a little bit of a journey over the past couple months. We had running probably around 30 to 50 different surveys across the company. None of that is being really analyzed at an Uber level. And so you're getting slices of how customers are giving their feedback around everything from like pricing to my level of support with my CSM or my professional services team is whatever that feedback is. And you're all hearing it from different angles, but it's not being brought up into one centralized place. And we have a 360 view of what the customer is telling us. So the goal was really around like, how do we bring it all together, democratize that data so that teams can really understand if you're talking to, the Lululemons of the world, like, exactly what are their pain points, what are their frictions, what's the actual sentiment of the customer, and how do you drive more stickiness? So that leads to sort of like best next action and recommendation. So when we think about like the conversation we just had, it's like why we wanted to build this within the customer marketing team is that this will help inform the types of adoption programs we run or the way that we engage a customer so that we could drive the relationship forward. And really,
And more stickiness, right? Like
yeah,
if you
it's
know
really about
what,
stickiness.
yeah.
But that's kind of how we structured it across the team. And I would say it's still fairly early stages too, right? Like I've been in organizations where we had essentially a NPS program for 5 or 10 years, but it wasn't necessarily giving us the type of recommendations we needed. And we're building it very thoughtfully now around like what's really going to move the needle. Because like I said, NPS is just one data point, but there's a lot of other things we could also capture to understand the real sentiment of what a customer is experiencing.
I heard you talk about Qualtrics. And so I'm thinking that a lot of this, and thanks for sticking with me on this research side of things.
Yeah.
I'm really honestly curious how you guys do it. So I heard you talk about Qualtrics and kind of like more, it sounds like it's more quantitative research. Do you guys do any qualitative, like get the customer on a call and have like a 30-minute conversation, 45-minute conversation?
We do. So a lot of this is sort of where we're in this kind of like crawl, walk, run phase. So it's kind of a build as we go. The Qualtrics implementation is sort of fairly recent, right? So when we think about like, we didn't have the right systems in place before, some of it was homegrown solutions, could even just been a Google Doc of some kind or a Google survey where all this feedback is being captured. So one piece is like centralizing it in one system. The second piece, your point is qualitative feedback was happening even before we started sort of a formal VOC practice, right? And I think this is where product marketing, they're very keen to connect with the customer on a regular basis. We have things like formal customer advisory boards that we use to get feedback from an executive audience. But then we also have things like roundtables and discussion points. And this is where I think like VOC can also be embedded into some of the other engagement programs you run. As an example, within community, we have a top contributors program. So that's a subset of really strong power users within the community. We do feedback discussions with products, and they can be in groups, so they could be one-to-one, where you can do the in-depth surveys. And we also have a group of what we call sort of like champions. These are sort of like the top 30 to 50 power users of some of our solutions. And we treat them as sort of like VIP so that we give them sort of an overall engagement and really meant to drive more of the relationship forward. And they'll have very discrete engagements with product, probably twice a year. We'll go through like a roadmap readout. And then we'll also give them opportunities if they want to participate in our early access programs. And they can have direct one-to-one conversations with the product teams on pretty much anything. But when I kind of talked about like how do you make sure you do this in a more thoughtful and programmatic manner as opposed to just like spraying and praying and just reaching out to everyone? We kind of aligned with our product team to say, let's leverage these core groups of advocates or customers. Let's figure out like what are the core things you care about and you want feedback from, and let's build like formal mechanisms to do it. And so we have these kind of going on as we also capture feedback through in product and other touch points too.
Do you feel like you have a good grasp of your customer? Like, do you have moments where you meet with them and you talk to them about like their life, like what's going on?
Yeah, we do have sort of like discrete motion. So I mentioned when we have sort of like our customer advisor board, we do that usually annually, so once a year. And that is a moment in time where we can talk about strategy. We can talk about what are the things that they mostly care about from a relationship with the organization, and is it solving real business challenges and problems? Then we also do very discrete practitioner engagements. I mentioned sort of like talking to these champs with product, twice a year, but our teams will also engage them periodically each quarter. And so we'll have very discrete opportunities throughout the year where we have like opportunities like just to connect with them and get their feedback too. And we also can do it kind of like real time or ad hoc in nature, because a lot of the ways that we engage them are, we have formal Slack channels where that's like coming in real time. We also have quarterly touch points like I talked about, which is sort of like webinar style. And then we have kind of like a program lead that's kind of ensuring that they're maintaining the relationship. So as things come up, we make sure that we capture it. We make sure that we get back to them in a timely manner and, be able to support them as needed.
Hey, it's Anna, host of Building with Buyers. I started the show because I found that customers play such an important role in business growth, but they're often overlooked. We're so focused on net new. But the thing that makes you unique is not your product. There are so many companies solving the same problem, and they have customers too. The thing that makes you unique is your superfan customers. That's your moat. Most positioning and messaging is guesswork. I'm a customer insights and strategy advisor, and I help my clients by interviewing their customer superfans and translating those insights into clear and compelling positioning and messaging that specific people care about. So you get deeper engagement with customers and prospects, increased inbound to demos, better sales conversations, increased word of mouth, and closed deals. If you're done guessing, stumbling along, and want to be more customer obsessed, reach out. I'd love to help. And now, back to the episode.
So it sounds like you feel pretty good about like how tight knit you guys are with your customers, and you probably have, you do have multiple products and it's a pretty large company with different people. And you had mentioned like everybody's they were doing this research, but kind of siloed. So your goal was to gather it and bring it together and have like, what's the purpose of this and how are we going to act on it? Right. So it sounds like you feel pretty good. Like from what I'm hearing from your side, like there are multiple touch points with customers and you have a pretty good grasp on like, who are these people? What do they care about? And what are the programs we should run for them? Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. I would say it's definitely been a little bit of sort of this like crawl, walk, run, right? Like
yeah.
When I started, a lot of these things didn't exist, or they were so fragmented that there really wasn't a main piece of insight you could kind of capture. It was very anecdotal in nature. It still is in some degree, but I think we've done a pretty good job as a team to kind of think about collectively, what is the main thing we're trying to solve for and what's going to give value to the organization? Because like if you're getting data points from a bunch of fragmented pieces of the business and you expect your executives to kind of figure it out, like that's not really that useful and helpful. And so if we can figure out like what are the big pain points, how do we close the loop more effectively? That's going to drive the state change, right? That's going to improve NPS organically because your customers know then they feel like you're actually talking their language and you're addressing their major concerns. And that's when it starts to create sort of that environment where, drives brand awareness, it drives referral business and everything else at the end of the day.
Yeah. And that's what executives actually care about, right? You're doing all these different tactics and you've got all of these different programs running. How is it impacting the business? I think that's where, you coming on board and being the VP of global customer marketing, like that's where customer marketing ends up being something that people recognize as strategic and important at the company and not just kind of random people doing random stuff because, I find that companies do customer marketing without knowing that they're doing customer marketing, but it doesn't become strategic until you actually put a leader behind it and bring people in that kind of like what you have, right? With life cycle and retention and advocacy and community and kind of like really focused on all these different areas that tie into business objectives. So,
yeah, to your point, like I think the challenge sometimes is that there usually isn't like an executive leader or sponsor that really believes in this wholeheartedly. And it's easy to get swept under the rug where all organizations within marketing, they're like, okay, well, our number one focus is drive pipeline. It's to drive growth for the organization. But I think CMOs also are evolving kind of their practice around like, it's not just about demand and brand. You also have to equate to what is going to be in the best interest of your install base and your customer base. And so it's sometimes a difficult conversation, but if you don't have that executive buy-in and that alignment, a lot of your programs don't necessarily even get to the C-suite and that visibility. And so it becomes, again, sort of like these tactical programs you're running that have impact, but they're not necessarily being bubbled up into what's actually moving the needle.
this is where like I don't know why it ends up being like kind of something that CMOs sleep on, which you mentioned like brand demand. That's pretty popular. Like we're all thinking about that,
Sure.
right? But your brand efforts and your demand efforts, they don't work well unless you have this like really strong customer love component and customer marketing component. I think that's where it's confusing to me. Like, why aren't we focusing on it? Because it impacts our brand so much and it impacts demand so much. And yet, leveraging your customers as part of growth is not, like you said, it's kind of like something that is swept under the rug unless it
Yeah.
becomes a focus from the executive team. So it's cool just to see like what that looks like at a company that truly does believe in this stuff. So love that. Okay. I should have asked this a long time ago, but I appreciate you kind of going on the windy path with me. We kind of talked a little bit about this already. Creative customer marketing plays an impact. Like maybe you can go back to something that you maybe mentioned already, but like, what would you say is in the past year and a half, something that's been pretty creative as a customer marketing play that you guys launched?
So when I mentioned sort of like adoption and retention being sort of like the on-ramp for, advocacy or customer love, et cetera, we spend a lot of time building this whole foundational practice. And essentially it's kind of, think of it as it's focused on channels in one area. So it's around how do you leverage your community to be sort of that feeder of driving overall engagement. We also encompass things like user groups as part of that. And then we also built out a holistic university. So how do we think about customer education as a way to upskill teams and your users at scale? So they could take the courses, they could take the trainings pretty much whenever they want. And then we also build out very prescriptive onboarding plans and programs. So think about like the pre-90 is what we describe, sort of like that first 30, 60, 90-day journey. We do that through email. We do that through in-app. And that's like a close partnership with our product and product marketing teams as well. So we create sort of like these multi-channel programs that's really meant to drive feature adoption and usage. We take those intent signals to then make sure like, how do we really cultivate those customers so that we're nurturing them so that they see the value faster? That's one thing that I think I'm actually really proud of the team for building it because it took a lot of time and cycles. And you can imagine just the number of integrations and requirements to kind of build that flywheel piece. The other thing is we built a lot of programs around, I mentioned voice of the customer, but we also do a lot of recognition programs. So we launched a global awards program fairly recently over the past 60 days or so. And when we think about like, how do we capture customer voice and use cases directly from the end user, the awards program was meant to solve for how do we celebrate our individuals. And like the products that we sell are both employee experience and customer service. And these are like really difficult jobs for most people, right? Like if you're a customer support agent, you don't necessarily get a lot of love. You get a lot of people complaining to you about how much your product sucks or friction points we need to resolve. If you think about your IT team, they're hearing it on the other side. These are folks that are like, my Wi-Fi is not working. Why can't I get my computer to operate? It's mostly complaints. And so we want to be able to kind of recognize and empower these individuals that don't necessarily get a lot of love from their peers or from the broader industry. And so the awards program was a way to kind of celebrate those voices opportunistically as well. I think we actually, as part of the process, we get to nominate 8 or 9 individuals that we'll recognize through public promotion of all these great things. But we also will capture a lot of these use cases, the customers that apply for the award programs. Naturally, those are stories that we can kind of feed in to support the rest of the go-to-market so that we know exactly what are those things that, they love about our solutions, or why did they pick us versus a competitor? There's a lot of great insights and nuggets that will then be used for everything for quotes and case studies, etc. But that's something that also is going to take it to another level. And I scratched the surface a little bit talking about this whole Champs program, but that was something that we had built even when I was at Marketo a couple of years back. And we wanted to build a more thoughtful way that we engage our customers based on their preferences. So the Champions program essentially is, I mentioned it's like 30 to 50 of our best customers. But this is a program that they have to kind of demonstrate expertise. So they have to apply for this initiative. They know up front there's a formal charter that they sign. And as part of that charter, they basically are saying I'm willing to do X, Y, Z for you in exchange for being able to participate in this initiative. And so we use these champions as sort of like our spokespeople, our evangelists or brand ambassadors, if you will. And they get to speak at our events. They get to be more active. They get to help essentially kind of shine a light on from a customer perspective. And it creates a little bit more of that personality and that voice, as opposed to just us as a Freshworks brand talking about all the benefits of what we do. And we're going to do a lot more things going to 26 on how we leverage this group. But those are kind of some things that I'm, most proud and excited from the team in developing this year.
I bet you that there's the listener that's listening to this episode and maybe some of the prior episodes is like, oh my gosh, how do I even get this going? Because we haven't focused on our customers in this way, right? Because you're so far ahead already, right? And all the different things that you've mentioned. There's teams of people, even for voice of customers. There's not just one person for doing that sort of work, right? So I imagine the listener is like, man, I need to get on this because we're just not doing that. And if somebody wanted to start to implement this with their customers, would customers raise their hand and want to get involved in this? And I imagine that many would not, because there's no prior history, right? Like what I just mentioned in the beginning of the episode, there's no prior history that's been built. So this requires a lot of time and nurturing and getting people excited and wanting to get these awards and wanting to come to events and wanting to do these challenges. And it's not easy and it takes time. And so that's why I'm kind of pushing this idea. Don't wait, don't sleep on it, because it's hard. It's dealing with people and trying to get them to do stuff that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, right? And so do you pay customers to kind of come to events? Do you have a payment program too? Or is it?
No, it's pretty much essentially 100% voluntary.
Voluntary. So that's the cool thing, right?
Yeah. Essentially kind of what you're describing is if someone is thinking about starting something, I would almost kind of go back to, you don't necessarily have to be building the scale of what we're doing. You could start with very small, basic infrastructure, right? If you can just build a program that essentially covers the major needs across your organization, whether you're a 100-person startup to a 5,000-person organization, start with a small idea and be able to kind of show the impact from that. And that's how you start to scale it out. When I thought about building out a champ program back in the day, when I was at Marketo, one of the things that we looked at is what are all the things that we as an organization need? Part of it is we need customer feedback. We need to be able to tap into all these evangelists to speak at our events. We need them to be our essentially brand ambassadors. And so and we also wanted them to be engaged in community and all these other things. So we made one program that essentially touched on all these other things that would support the business in some meaningful way. And that gave us the ability to start to hire other roles. It gave us the ability to get more budget and resourcing. But it started with a foundational thing of what are we trying to solve for first? And then also equally important is like, what's in it for the customer? So if you can kind of balance it out between everything that you want and you line it back to what the customer cares about, that's naturally a win-win situation. That's when you get a customer to say, I'm going to invest, 2 hours out of my month or 2 hours out of my week to do things on behalf of this organization, even though I have a full-time job and responsibilities that I'm also doing. That becomes sort of like the differentiator of getting your customer to want to do something instead of having to like force them and make it feel like a transactional relationship.
That's the difference right there. Instead of customer relationships just being transactional, they are not anymore. Like your organization, right? Other organizations that really do focus on customer marketing, customer love, and all this stuff. I want to talk about impact, if that's okay. You don't need to. I mean, I didn't even have to ask you, because just the fact that you're not paying your customers and they're already doing all this cool stuff with you guys is already impactful in a way, right, to the organization, because you're getting all this content and giving them the floor so they could talk about what matters to them and how they're killing it in their work. And also, by the way, Freshworks is part of their success. So that's already impact. But what do you focus on when you're talking to executive leadership at Freshworks and they really care, like, okay, customer marketing, prove to me that you're actually doing something that is impacting the business?
It's actually really timely because I was mentioning before we started filming that like we did our offsite this week and we're going through AOP and planning. So a lot of the things that we consider are like the big drivers for us. Historically, the way we thought about goals is that it was very transactional. It was like the number of case studies, number of customers engaged in a program. That's all great stuff, but like it doesn't ladder up into the major business goals and objectives that your CEO would care about. So for us in particular, we look at how are we driving expansion? How are we driving adoption of our core solutions and products? And we do that as sort of like shared goals with both our product organization, engineering, et cetera. That's how you start to make it so that it's not just a one-sided equation. It doesn't have real business impact or value. And our overall goal is like, how do we support NDR, net dollar retention for the business? And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to solve for because there's a lot of things that go into supporting that. But if you're able to say that some of this is building sort of like a general theory and do some like cohort analysis, if you can essentially say like the customers that are engaging in your programs or in your community or et cetera, reduce churn by X percentage, that's a theory that we want to prove out. And then you can start to partner with your sales and operations teams to really kind of build out that model effectively. So that's how we're kind of approaching it to kind of solve for, exactly, are these things actually driving impact or are they just programs that you're running?
Yeah. And also, you could look at it in like the customers that are involved in these customer marketing programs that you're building. They're at these companies. Like, how long do they stay? Like, what's the retention rate, right? Are
Yeah.
they staying
Yep.
longer than the ones that are not involved in these programs? And I bet you're probably seeing that. Yes, they are, because why would they not be? Why would they leave? Then they move on to another organization. And then do they use Freshworks there? Right? Like, that is some things that you could measure. The other thing is, when you have a net new deal close, like, was there a customer that was involved in that process? Do you guys look at that too? Because that to me is interesting.
Yeah, we look at it from a reference deal velocity perspective. So like every time that you have a prospect talks to a customer in some way, does it close the deal X days faster or X weeks or whatever? That's also kind of, something we do look at.
Well, it wouldn't be a marketing podcast if we didn't talk about AI. So I wanted to ask you, what are your favorite use cases of AI in your role at the moment?
The biggest one for us, probably every team, regardless if you're in marketing or other function, is content. How are you leveraging it to help you, one, not just draft content, but think a little bit differently in terms of the content you want to create that's resonating? I think we're at this kind of point of disruption where even the formal kind of website is evolving. And the ways that traditional buyers, they go to a website, they go through your information, they read a case study, but we're in the age where it's like people's attention spans are so low at this point that like, I don't remember the last time I actually read a case study, like a full page case study brief. And so we're thinking about like the content that is going to resonate with a user, especially if their attention span is like they're on TikTok and they're watching 5-second, 30-second video clips. So we're creating it both from the content we produce, but also like the video and assets we develop. When we think about like education, people don't necessarily have time to watch a 3-hour to 8-hour training or certification, but if we can give them like bite-sized micro courses, that's going to show them exactly how to do X, Y, Z. And that's also why the classic sort of YouTube examples has been so popular over the years, because people go for a very specific thing that they're trying to solve for. And you can start to embed that more deeply in your marketing and your programs. That becomes more of a game changer, and it creates more of that stickiness. So we're doing some of the content as well as the video optimization at the moment.
What tools are you using? Sorry.
For university in particular, we're actually migrating to a new solution. I won't mention the name because it's still going
You're
through
migrating,
evaluations. But that's going to help us actually kind of speed up both the content that we produce and the courses develop for video. From a written content perspective, we use everything from Gemini to Perplexity. I actually really like Claude myself.
I'm a fan of Claude. Yeah.
Yeah. For like a lot of research and stuff and just writing out long form content.
Totally. Because I was using ChatGPT before, and ChatGPT is like my everyday random things I need, but Claude is specific to long form content. Like it's pretty good. And then you know what Claude doesn't do? It doesn't ask me like, do you want me to blah, 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 blah after I gave you that answer?
Yeah.
Thank you for not asking me that, because I didn't want you to do anything after. Just do the thing and then stop.
Yeah.
So I enjoy that part.
And I think like a lot of companies were starting to experiment with like, we didn't talk necessarily about tools on this conversation, but a lot of the agentic workflows, that's like sort of like the next big hurdle for us. Like how do you, one, get your systems to talk to each other, but then build the workflow so that the data engages and like you can take your next best recommended action from it. And that's going to be a lot of fun as we get to that point in time. But yeah, that's really a third bucket.
That's what you guys are going to probably think about for 2026 is agentic workflows. Okay. Awesome.
And that requires a lot more planning and thought with just IT and other functions to help us.
Totally. I'm putting together, speaking of long form content, the season 5 of the show has taken like basically this whole year. I've talked to people about different customer marketing plays, creative customer marketing plays. And so one of the things you mentioned about case studies, like you don't remember the last time you read a long case study, a cool creative idea that one company that I brought on somebody from that company and they mentioned is you don't really treat it as a case study. What you do is you turn it into a playbook. So it kind of solves for both. It is useful now. It's beyond just the proof.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes useful. Here's the playbook that this customer is using with the tool. So it kind of goes beyond. I think that's pretty creative, right? It becomes not just the proof, but also how do I use this thing? What's an example? And then I can use that playbook for myself. So I think that is worthwhile. I do think people will read that more than they'll read the whole long, case study. I don't need that. I just need a little snippet of proof.
Totally.
So that's one cool idea. Hopes, fears for 2026. I just had somebody on, a head of customer marketing from Intel was on a little while back. And she asked me, like, what's everyone talking about when people talk about AI? She's a senior manager of customer marketing. What's everyone talking about when they talk about AI? Like, are they nervous about it taking our jobs? Or like, what's everyone saying? And so she asked me this like vulnerable question, but I wanted to see what you thought about, hopes and fears for 2026 personally.
I would say we'll start with a positive. I think the hopes if we're talking specifically around AI, it's to basically make us much more strategic and effective as practitioners and customer marketers in general. I think the fear with AI is that it's easy to go to AI and make yourself a little bit too lazy in terms of not thinking more critically. I think you can make the argument too around sort of like, is AI replacing jobs and all that? I'm of the mindset it's really more about optimization because it's exciting and also worrying in the fact that we're evolving so quickly. I think even if just this year, it feels like we've had so much more leaps and bounds we did collectively over the past 3 or 4. The ability to kind of catch up and like learn as quickly as possible. I don't think it necessarily helps that a lot of AI experts, if you call them that, or thought leaders in the space, they're pushing out things that are like very provocative in their statements around like AI and if you don't catch up, then it's going to replace your job. I think there's a little bit of an aspect around the average human that's depending on where they are in their career, like they're learning. We're all in this kind of exploration phase. And I think sometimes we just approach it from a stance of fear only. But I think there's really an opportunity to really think about optimization within yourself and your team, solving for that, because AI, as much as it's going to be a disruptor, a lot of companies are still being a little bit careful in terms of their approach. Like especially larger organizations, they're not going to necessarily replace their entire workforce overnight. And there's going to be some training, there's going to be some optimization required. And I think even just the AI models, they're evolving every day. Like all of them are going to be different. We don't even know what's going to be like 12 months from now, let alone the next 3 or 4 years in the future. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think it's probably going to help us with optimization. I've seen some articles around talking about sort of like this AI enabled prompt marketer of some kind. Essentially it's really how do you prompt the AI to give you the best results? And I think that's kind of where the magic is going to be in the future. And that's probably where a lot of the training and expertise will go. But I think that will help really unlock the potential of AI.
Totally. I also have a more positive outlook, and I don't like those folks that are like fear mongering. And I think that's why these conversations pop up on the show too. Like, what's everyone saying? What has everyone been thinking? Like, am I the only one that's having these thoughts? And I appreciate that, Kevin. And especially just kind of like coming from someone that's leadership in an IPO'd company, right? And building out, and you have like large groups of people that look up to you and kind of how you think about AI and as part of your work and where it's going in 2026. We're all learning, right?
Yeah.
And so I also said in the last episode, like, I don't know. We don't know. We don't know how it's all going to shake out. Like some people will say it's going to take our jobs, and some people are going to say, no, it's not because we need humans. And we don't know. But I think first, it all starts out as like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Because we don't know. So we're kind of nervous. But then it all kind of comes out sort of like levels things, and we get more used to it, just like any other tool. So
yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. Awesome conversation. Thank you so much for going off on tangents with me, especially on the research side and talking through some of the work that you're doing. And like, these are huge, impactful efforts. And I really appreciate you sharing all that with me. If anybody wants to find Kevin, he's on LinkedIn, Kevin Kenneth Lau. Kenneth is your middle name, I assume.
Yeah. My middle name.
And Freshworks, you can find it by going to freshworks.com. Kevin, once again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Building with Buyers. New episodes drop weekly, so make sure you're following wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me on LinkedIn, Anna Furmanov. Visit my website to learn more about how to turn customer insights into positioning and messaging your buyers will understand. FurmanovMarketing.com. And don't forget to leave a review if you're loving the show.